Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 6. Every time the raft bucked and shuddered beneath them, Molly couldn't help imagining the brown water closing over her head again. She could swim, but no one swam well enough to survive in the Mississippi when it was flooded like this. There wasn't one current to fight, there were 10 or 20, all jostling around against one another. Molly squeezed her hands tighter on the rope, then loosened them. She was chilled through. The cold rain had finally let up, but now the wind was rising. Her legs and feet felt almost numb. The rough bark dug into her skin, and she shifted her weight, rolling onto her side as far as she could without loosening her grip on the ropes. As she lifted her head, she blinked, surprised at the light of the moon. Garrett was sitting up now, holding on with only one hand. He was rubbing his knee, his face contorted with pain. "Are you hurt?" she asked him, dragging herself into a sitting position. He shook his head. "No, my hands are just cramped shut." Molly nodded. She began tightening her own grip, then loosening it again, over and over, trying to work life back into her fingers. "I'm hungry," Garrett said so quietly she could barely hear him over the water. Then he straightened. "Look!" Molly saw a dark shape out of the corner of her eye. She turned and faced upriver, straining to see in the moonlight. Above them, sliding along the contour of current, chasing the raft, was something huge. She stared at the formless silhouette that loomed in the near darkness. Molly nudged Garrett with her foot. "What is that?" "I don't know, but whatever it is, I wish we could get farther away from it." Without thinking, Molly began working her hands harder. She saw Garrett notice, then he nodded. "Mine are bad, too. I can barely make my muscles work." He raised his right hand and glared at it. Molly glanced upriver. The dark shape seemed closer. It looked solid enough to be a house, but in the murky moonlight it was hard to tell. Something hit her leg hard, and she flopped back over, bending her knee to ease her shin. "I'm sorry," Garrett said. He was wrestling awkwardly with the pole, both hands on the smooth wood. Molly freed one hand to take hold of his shirt tail. He shot her a grateful glance and worked the pole around so that it was pointing upstream. Molly watched him, then raised her eyes and gasped. The dark shape was getting bigger. It was closer. Molly sat up, clumsily managing to keep one hand on Garrett's shirt and the other on the rope. She doubled her legs beneath her, feeling the dig of the bark as she continued to squeeze the rope in quick, convulsive little jerks. Her hands were both aching now, and she hoped that it was a good sign. Molly heard Garrett curse, and she glanced sideways. He was struggling with the pole. She tightened her hand on his shirt as he angled it upward, fighting the movement of the raft. Finally, the pole nearly vertical, he tried to jam one end into the space between two logs near the center of the raft. He couldn't. "What are you doing?" Molly shouted into the wind. He had risen on his knees, and she was barely able to keep hold of his shirt and the rope at the same time. Garrett didn't answer except to gesture upstream. Molly turned and could only stare. It was a house. A whole house, floating on its side. And it was really close now. The sharp peak of the roof was facing her, sticking out like broken bones were pale branches and splintered planks trapped beneath the slant of the eaves. Garrett was leveling the pole at the house, and for the first time Molly understood what he was trying to do. If he could hold them away from it, they might be able to maneuver to the side, let it go past. If not, they could get dragged under the roof line. Molly shifted her hold on Garrett's shirt to his pant legs as he struggled to steady the pole against the logs. His feet were braced widely apart. The pole dipped and wavered like a heavy spear. Molly could see the rows of shingles on the roof now, the moonlight glinting off the wet wood. She watched the tip of the pole as Garrett lowered it. It skated along the slant, then caught on the edge of the tin strip that capped the roof. Suddenly, Garrett slipped and fell. He sprawled, then curled forward, fighting to stay on the raft. The pole dropped, falling flat, rolling across the logs. Molly reached out, and Garrett locked his hand on her wrist, hauling himself back to kneel beside her. She could hear his rasping breath above the river and the wind and the desperate pounding of her own heart. An instant later the raft shuddered as the peak of the roof struck it. "Hang on!" Garrett screamed. Molly reached for the pole. "But if we can both brace it, we could." "No!" Garrett shouted at her. "Just hold on!" Molly pinned the pole beneath her leg to keep it on the raft, then shifted her hands back to the rope. The river pulled them a few feet ahead of the house, then seemed to shove it toward them. The logs jolted, and Molly cried out in pain as they trapped her right. Hand. She managed to pull it free, but before she could find a new handhold, the house battered the raft again. Molly wrenched around to face Garrett, feeling the pole grind against her shin. "The hand axe!" She shouted the words into his ear and pushed at his shoulder. He rolled sideways so she could get at the sack. With Garrett grasping her shoulder, Molly fumbled at the knot. The salt sack was wet through now, and the cloth was stiff. Hands shaking, she finally got it open. She tucked the hand axe beneath her arm as she resecured the sack, then glanced up and saw the confusion on Garrett's face. At that instant the house slammed the raft again, and she grabbed at the pole, the hand axe still held beneath her arm. By the time the raft steadied, the pole was sliding free. Garrett lunged after it, and Molly let go of the rope to grab his ankle. "We can sharpen the end," Molly shouted at him, and he dragged it back toward him. He stared at her for a second, then nodded, and she could tell he understood. "You hold it," Molly yelled, but he was already turning the pole around, extending the thickest end toward her, his movements crab-like as he used first one hand, then the other, keeping hold of the rope as he worked. The whole pole braced against his thigh and angled downward at a gentle slant. Garrett looked up into Molly's face as the raft jolted again. They swayed together at the shock, like trees hit by a gust of wind. Molly looked out across the river, steeling herself for what she had to do. The water was endless, dark, hissing, and roiling around the drowned house. "Be careful!" Garrett yelled. Molly nodded and rose up onto her knees, the bark digging into her skin. She crawled, grasping the hand axe, until she was beside him. Working sideways like this, she could swing the axe without hitting Garrett, or her own legs. But here she couldn't reach the raft ropes. There was no secure place for her to hold on. As if to reinforce her fear, the river slammed the house into the raft once more. Molly felt Garrett's hand on her back as he doubled over to regain his hold. When he straightened up, he shouted a single word. "Hurry!" Molly squared her stance, ignoring the bite of the rough bark as she rose up on her knees and lifted the axe. She struck downward at an angle, then struck again. The third time she raised the axe, Garrett rotated the pole so that her next blow cut into fresh wood. Breathing hard, Molly felt the axe slice into the wood and saw the chips fly upward. Garrett turned it again, and she kept working. The house hit the raft, a quick, unnerving jerk that knocked Molly off balance. She dropped to all fours in time to steady herself against the next jarring blow, but the hand axe skittered across the logs and disappeared into the water. "Help me!" Garrett was shouting. Molly stood up. An odd, hollow feeling in her right hand, where the solid axe handle had been a moment before. She guided the forward end of the pole as Garrett jammed the sharpened end into a crack between the raft logs. This time it held. When the house struck them again, Molly had the pole in position to catch beneath the tin strip. She leaned her entire weight onto the pole, keeping it from sliding out of the crack. The raft felt loose and flighty beneath her bare feet, and she gripped the logs with her toes as best she could. When the house fell back a few feet, she repositioned the pole. The next collision pushed the raft a little to one side. By the fourth time the house rammed into their pole, they had worked their way so far along the roofline that Garrett twisted the pole free. Molly dropped to her knees and anchored one hand to the ropes and the other to his right ankle. Garrett shoved at the side of the house, pulling past the broken, empty windows and the sad ruin of the porch. A moment later, the house was sliding past, riding the swifter current, as the raft veered off into the quieter channel. Molly fell onto the raft and felt Garrett's arm steady her as they huddled together against the chilling wind.